Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here once again presenting a paper about firm policies and active ownership investors with this set of co-authors, the ABC co-authors. This paper is about how investors affect firm policies. Let me start with something very broad, the two extreme versions of engagement that we consider. One of them would be activist investors. These are investors that buy, enact change, and sell. And on the other extreme of the spectrum, we would have the index funds, the most passive investors, investors that don't have the possibility of exiting, but can still affect firms through voice. And then there's a huge middle ground, right? There's active ownership investors that are neither of these. I include in them, it's a very broad and heterogeneous category with pension funds, mutual funds, sovereign wealth funds. And these are investors that have, they hold diversified, long-term oriented portfolios, like the passive investors, but they are away from the benchmark, they are active, they can rebalance, right? Not as frequently as hedge funds, but this is a bit of a middle ground. And I think a narrower question, still very broad, is can active ownership investors affect firm policies, right? Question on which we have a lot of literature, we have a lot of evidence, but I think we have still an incomplete picture, and I think this paper tries to contribute, in a broad sense, to this picture. And there's a specific class of active ownership investors, which are sovereign wealth funds. And sovereign wealth funds can be important instrumentally to answer this question for two reasons. First of all, they're important shareholders. But secondly, they often have specific preferences about issues beyond returns, right? Not necessarily independent from returns, but they're not exactly returns. For example, the New Zealand fund has an explicit stance on fostering green investments. The Qatar fund worries about country branding, about leaving the country in a good position. And the Norwegian fund cares about, among other things, good corporate governance, right? And these preferences can be useful because they are an area in which there may be a misalignment between the interest of the management or of the firm and the fund. And here we can make some more progress about understanding the influence of investors on firms. Now, this may not be enough. If we see some sorting of investors towards given funds or investments towards different investors, it could come from both ends, right? It's the fund interest and the firm interest. But I'd like to think that changes in these fund preferences are particularly useful to understand shareholder influence. Whenever these preferences changes, then we have a situation where we have more hope to understand the firm's reaction to these changes. So what do we do in this paper? We use an unexpected change in the governance preference of the Norwegian Investment Management Fund, the NBIM, to see its impact on firm governance. We want to disentangle where this change of preferences affected firms. And the specific setting is that in November 2012, NBIM announced through a note that it's going to have more emphasis on effective corporate governance. And in particular, it's a relatively broad governance concept, but it focuses mostly on board accountability and composition and equal shareholder voting. This was unexpected, at least at an annual frequency. I think you could think that over 2012, this thing happened. It was slowly released to the press, and also the fund may have expected itself. But from the point of view of our research, which is at an annual frequency, this happened somewhere between 2011 and 2012. So the research questions are, first of all, did NBIM really target its investment to its new stated preferences? Was this just cheap talk, or did they do something about this? Can we have some evidence of this being real? And second, and more importantly, did firms react to this change in preferences? So most of the job has been done because you've seen the summary, but NBIM is the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. It does have a governance strategy that says that basically they're going to actively engage with firms. They have the intention to engage with firms. They can exclude firms that fail to engage with them, and this is part of their investment strategy too. And they try to participate in activist campaigns. So they take stands whenever you have to vote yes or no. They try to take an active stance in these campaigns. But they also have a clear investment strategy. So broadly, they try to benchmark the FTSE Global Cap Index, to which they apply some country corrections. So this is like their benchmark. But this is just some kind of reference point. In reality, they can over-underweight firms according to their expected performance and governance. So they are allowed to really deviate from this benchmark as much as they feel like. And they also exclude firms that don't fulfill the ethics committee principles or the ethics kind of principles of the fund. So in more formal terms, the investment intensity of the fund in a firm is composed of, first of all, two indicator functions that say this firm is a firm that we like from an ethics perspective, and it's a firm that talks to us. And once these two are fulfilled, once these two are ones, we're going to invest this amount, but we are allowed to deviate, right? And one thing that's interesting about this function here is that some of the elements are exogenous to the fund, and some of the elements are kind of discretionary to the fund. I mean, they reflect the fund's preferences. And this is going to be useful later when it comes to identifying what's going on. So the empirical approach, we're going to pick from the universe of icon measures the management score as the one that closely resembles the target of this announcement of the fund, or this note of the fund, in terms of changing preference for governance. As our measure, think of this as an equally weighted sum of a ranking over 34 indicators. So all our measurements are in ranking terms from 0 to 100. So 1 means 1% increase in your ranking. We're going to have a difference in difference approach using the changing preferences of the fund, right, with some firms inside and outside the fund. And we're going to try to decompose the effect into changes in the investment strategy of the fund, changes in the governance strategy of firms, and also some new equilibrium effects or new market effects. And to start with, let's look at the overall effect. So put yourselves in the shoes of a future pensioner in Norway that asks the following question. After this announcement, did the governance of the money, the pool of money that I'm investing on, did it improve or not? And the answer is yes. The answer is after the announcement, the average governance of the portfolio of MBIM went up by about 4 to 5 ranking points, right? So quite substantial. It's about a third of a standard deviation, right? So as a whole, the portfolio was invested in better governed companies according to this index. And the question is why? What is behind this movement, right? So we are going to try to decompose this increase. So what I've just shown you is an increase in governance. This is the difference between two indices, right? Think of each index as the weighted sum of the governance of all the individual components inside the firm, right? This is the future, this is the after the announcement, this is before the announcement. Now I can express this index as the original index plus some deltas, some improvements or some changes in the weights and in the governance. And just by very small manipulation, I can rearrange these things in this following way, right? And this is a very intuitive way to see things. So the overall change in the governance index of the fund is first of all due to the reweighting of the fund. So take the governance of firms as given, and then look at how the fund changed its investment strategy after the announcement. But second, you can do the mirror image. You can fix the weights of the fund and look at the change in the governance of the firms inside the fund, right? That would be the pure firm reaction. And finally, there's a cross product, which is like whether the deltas are more or less correlated after the announcement. And it turns out that this not only is a very simple decomposition, but it has a clear interpretation in terms of economics. The overall change in the governance of the pool of money is composed of the change in the strategy of MBIM, the change in the strategy of the firms, and this is standard. This can be seen as an intent-to-treat regression, very, very clear cut. You'll see in a minute, and also as a function of a new kind of equilibrium. Okay, so this is the roadmap for what I'm going to do next. I'm going to show you these three elements, how they decompose this total change in the governance of MBIM. So first element, what was the effect of the announcement on the investment strategy of MBIM? And for this, I'm going to try to follow that structure. So first of all, I'm going to try to fix the governance types of firms. I'm going to fix the governance of firms at a snapshot of 2011. I'm going to think of the firms having always the same governance as kind of a type. And then I'm going to relate that governance in a different setting to an indicator of whether MBIM enters a new firm as a new investment, or whether it leaves, where it drops a firm from the portfolio. And the question I'm trying to answer is that do firms that enter or exit MBIM have better or worse governance before or after the announcement? Right? So I'm comparing, it's a different dip, so I'm comparing firms that enter before the announcement with firms that enter after the announcement compared to the population of firms. I can have 3 different control groups, firms outside MBIM, firms inside MBIM, or all firms. And regardless, the firms that enter the fund after the announcement have better governance than before the announcement, right? So the marginal firm that enters the fund has a better index after the announcement than before. Now, remember I told you that not all the changes in the investment strategy of the fund are discretionary. Some of them are mechanical. So I could focus on those changes in investment that are discretionary, kind of exclude anything that comes directly from the index. If I do that, the effect is actually emphasized. So if I concentrate on those elements that are discretionary to the fund, I can actually see that the effect is actually larger. How about exit? Do firms that exit the fund have worse governance after the announcement? And the answer is yes. They do have worse governance after the announcement, about 5 to 6 rank points after the announcement. And again, if I focus on the discretionary divestitures of the fund, the effect is actually larger. Right? So putting it all together, the investment strategy of the fund does seem to target, does seem to kind of follow their announcement. After the announcement, entrants have better inherent governance, and after the announcements, exits have worse inherent governance. By inherent, I mean that I'm fixing the governance. I'm keeping the governance of the firms as fixed. And the effects are stronger for discretionary investment changes. Now, this I see it as an auxiliary result. This is a result that shows you that there was something going on in the fund after the announcement. But also we could see it as, that this exit and entry could provide some of the incentives for firms to improve governance. But also engagement, that part we cannot observe. Right? So there could be other changes. That is just one of the changes. So let's go to the second part, more like the meat of the problem. Did firms change the governance after the announcement of MBIM? And here what we would like to do is relate the governance of firms to a definitive structure in which we have the post-announcement and belonging to MBIM. And the problem is that this indicator here is correlated with the error term. I've just shown you that there's a correlation between being in MBIM and your governance. So what can we do? We instrument your actual holdings with a snapshot of the holdings just before the announcement. Right? Those are going to be the holdings we use throughout this second part. And this is a very standard intent to treat. The reduced form regression simply requires replacing this with the snapshot of the holdings into NT11. And this mirrors the decomposition I was showing you before. I'm fixing the weights just before the announcement, and I'm tracking the firms. Okay? So if you do that, first of all, the aggregate effect is quite positive. The reduced form effect is 4.9 rank points. So the firms that were in the portfolio at the time of the announcement, over the next 4 years, they improved their index, their governance. The effect is important at the announcement level, just at announcement, but it keeps growing over time as well. So it has some momentum. It's not just a one-shot effect. Now, this is a reduced form regression. I can rescale it to give you the IV regression that is directly comparable with the index that I was showing you before. And this is the result of the treatment on the treated. This is the actual economic magnitude of the effect, which is about 3.1 rank points on the year of the announcements, increasing to nearly 5 rank points. This is like 5% better ranked, after 4 years. Now here I'm pushing my luck. So I'm overimposing the overall effect and the IV effect, but these are point estimates. So there's a confidence interval around this that is quite broad, so we can't rule out much. But we could conjecture, if we just trust the point estimates, that from the overall effect, the bulk of the effect is the firm effect. It has to come from either firms trying to please the fund or from engagement, right? There's a little bit of the effect that comes from the rebalancing of the portfolio. Right? But again, you should see that as more or less an auxiliary result rather than the bulk of the effect. Most of the effect comes from firms actually changing. Now, what's this slide about? This slide is about the possible confounding factors. So the fund loads heavily on the FTSE index, so it could be that the FTSE is changing. We're lucky, and it happened at the same time. And it's true, both of them are moving in the same direction at the same time. However, when you put them together, it is the fund that seems to dominate the effect. It's not belonging to the FTSE what matters, it's belonging to the fund what matters. And here we have a narrower disaggregation, so firms that are only in MBIM do have an effect. Firms that are in both do have an effect. Firms that are only in FTSE, they don't have an effect at the announcement date. And firms that are excluded because of the ethics kind of principles, they also don't have a governance effect. So this is, in a way, a cleaner identification that it is belonging to the fund what is driving the result and not some confounding factor related to the belonging to the index. Okay, so next is a slightly more subtle question. So what is more important? Is it more important that you are a big investment inside the fund? You are very important to the fund? Or is it very important that the fund is big inside your firm, which is not the same thing, right? The fund could be very big and say a small firm. So these are fund weights. These are quartiles. The omitted categories, you are not in the fund, right? And these are just low, medium, high ownership in the fund. And the effect, it's monotonically increasing. So the more important you are to the fund, the higher the effect, but it's quite flat. It's almost like a jump, really. The most important thing is whether you belong to the fund or not. The intensity to which you represent in the fund is not so important. The firm percentage shows a slightly different version. If the fund has a small fraction of ownership inside the firm, the effect is negligible. It's not statistically significant. It's only when the fund has a large fraction of ownership inside the firm that the fund can be influential to the firm. Right? So the firm only pays more attention only when the fund has a substantial ownership stake in the fund. But in general, both the intensive and extensive margin matter. So do firms change strategy after the announcement? Yes, after the announcement, the included firms increase the governance index. Both the weight of the firm, the fund in the firm, and the firm in the fund matter. And we do have a longish section in the paper about heterogeneous effect. I don't have time to go in detail, but we do find that the effect is stronger among smaller firms, among those with worse performance, among those with a medium level of pre-existing governance, those who had room for improvement, but they were not too bad to start with. And also among illiquid stocks. This is potentially interesting because the threat of exit is much tougher for illiquid stocks. So these are also the ones that react most. And also the effects are higher in better governed countries. Let me, by the way, go back and emphasize that throughout the whole analysis, I neutralize completely the country effect. So we have country dummies and country time post dummies. So the evolution of countries over time, all of these things are completely neutralizing the effect. This is only a within country effect. Each firm is compared to like-for-like firms in the same country. Final element, deltas on deltas, right? This is the one that is probably most interesting economically. Are we moving towards a new equilibrium in which changes in governance lead to changes in ownership and vice versa? But econometrically is the one where we can say the least. But at the very least, I can show you that after the announcement, the delta weights of the fund and the delta governance of the firms are more correlated than before the announcement. Right? So in a way, the new equilibrium is an equilibrium in which the two things co-move more after the announcement than before. From the perspective of causality, I cannot say much here, but you can imagine from the previous two sections that it goes both ways. Right? The fund is more responsive, and the firms are more responsive to the fund after the announcement. So to conclude, the preference of sovereign wealth funds provide evidence on how active investors can affect firm policies. I think something that distinguishes this paper from other papers is that this is a fund-specific change in preferences across all firms. This is not a specific action on something that we think this firm needs. This is across the board. It's a bit systemic in a way, in the sense that we were commenting before. The new governance stance of being was followed by changes in investment policies, and most of the effect comes from the firm's reaction. The firms is the bulk. This kind of hypothetical pensioner that wants to know whether the governance of the fund got better, the governance of the firms in the fund got better, is mostly the firms that are doing the job here. It's not the rebalancing of the fund. And also the heterogeneous effects are quite informative about the channels of this effect. Thanks.
Let me try to summarize this paper in one slide. I think Vicente did a great job. It has a couple of nice elements. Number one is, first of all, it's looking at NBIM. And apparently in November 2012, there is a note, or the note, where NBIM unexpectedly announces that now it will pay more attention to the corporate governance of the companies that it invests in. Obviously, it's a large player, therefore it matters, or at least this is what we want to see, whether it matters. The authors get the governance scores from this company called Econ, And particularly within the governance, scores that is provided by it, they are taking the management scores because apparently that's the biggest, if you like, coverage of 34, if you like, provisions. And what they show is basically, the first finding is this graph over there that Vicente also shared, is that after this announcement, there's an increase in the governance score. Okay, that's the first thing. After the NBIM announces that it's going to care more about the governance of the companies, it seems that the companies that are in their portfolio goes up in their governance scores compared to the ones that are outside of it. Then they dig deeper into that. They want to understand what kind of drives this. And this, I find it quite cute and nice machinery over here. That you look at this delta G, this is the governance, and then you can basically write it in 3 forms. Well, you first fix the governance and see the changes in the weights in the investment, and then you fix the weights and then see the changes in the governance of the company, and then the changes in both, where Vicente is calling the equilibrium effect. Well, what are the weights? The weights are your investment in that particular company at that year divided by your total investment. And this investment itself is dictated by a couple of filters. One is basically the NBIM is engaging with the firm. The second is whether they are, I guess, satisfying certain ethical standards. And then there is the weight of the FTSE Global. And then they don't necessarily tie their hands too strictly to basically what this FTSE Global is providing. They also give themselves a little bit of a room to basically maneuver and then overweight or underweight these companies. And looking at these 3 components, the first component basically gives them that after the note, there is increased investment in firms with better governance and decreased investment in firms with worse governance. That's one of the reasons why we are seeing an increase in overall. Second thing is, this is the second bit, they find that for the companies that are already invested in, they see an improvement in the governance. And the third one is basically they also find that these changes in the governance and weights are correlated, which seems to be kind of a good sign. Now, if you want to do this horse race, what the authors are saying is that this is the second channel. These improvements in the firm governance really plays an important role. And it works both in the extensive and intensive margins. That means the companies within the portfolio versus outside. And within the portfolio, they also look at different importance of the companies, how much basically you are exposed to the company versus how much you're holding into the company. The more basically important the company, the more basically it reacts to that. The same for the first one, the discretion plays a bigger role. That's the paper in a nutshell. So far, so good? Okay, now they find also that these effects are stronger for better governed countries, which I will come to. Now, my comments will be in maybe 3-4 parts. The first one is I'll tell you where I stand. I guess that's one of the reasons why I'm invited, because I have a paper that's titled Active Ownership with Elroy Dimson and Sheely. Therefore, it's very dear to me. I'm very sympathetic to the paper and its findings. First, for those ones who don't know, I'll just tell you where I am so that how I see things from where I look. And then I'll tell you some other papers that are working on NBIM, because NBIM is a great, basically, laboratory because they are so transparent. If you go to their website, there's a counter that tells you how much is the money now. You can get easily hooked up into that. And very transparent in how they invest. Therefore, there's some other papers which may enrich the discussion, I guess. Then I'll get into the specifics of the analysis. This is kind of a nice, I think, setup. And there's a bit of a shock. And then there is this machinery. And I'll try to really check whether it's going to be airtight. And then maybe this will give ideas to the authors in their revisions. Okay, now where I stand. I already mentioned that this paper, Active Ownership with Elroy Dimson and Sheely, we are looking at basically the companies that are engaged by a large UK asset manager for ESG reasons. And in that paper, what we are finding is that the successfully engaged companies, which is 18% of the case, basically enjoy some improvements in their stock performance, accounting performance, and other basically governance indices. Well, basically, the nutshell, the way I see that paper is basically this paper shows there is hope. Like if you do these engagements properly, well, you may create value. Obviously, you should be careful when not extrapolating. Maybe this is one of the best that we've just encountered. But at least if it is done properly, it can create value. Well, how much does it create value? One benchmark is, I think, with Alon's paper. When hedge funds get into the company, they generate about 7-8% of abnormal returns, whereas in this case, we are finding about 2%. And the way I liken this is basically hedge funds, I find them like a math teacher. They kick in the company, ask what is 2 + 3, and then if you don't tell them 5, sell the, fire the CEO, pay more dividends, change the capital structure, etc. Whereas this one is a bit like, I think maybe what Lucian was mentioning is also, it's like a music teachers. They want to basically get the accord right. And that's why also it's very difficult to measure this. And that's, I think, what's the taxonomy definitions, et cetera, we are talking about. Therefore, this activism, that what we call the ESG activism, kind of sits in between, or active ownership, between hedge fund activism, very aggressive and maybe very well-defined, versus the institutional activism in the 90s, where maybe things were a bit not that successful. And it's less aggressive, but still useful. Now, what does come out of this study? Although it focuses on more ENS issues, it also finds that for the governance engagements, the G index, the famous governance index, or E index that later on Lucian refined, increases. Therefore, I'm very sympathetic to the findings of the paper that, well, after these engagements, the governance scores improve. Yeah, I think that's sensible. Now, two other basic insights that came out of this paper is that, well, there is the reputational concerns of the target companies play a big role. Maybe this was related to this gentleman's point that if you are a consumer-facing company where your reputation is at stake, there's big sticks and big carrots regarding these ESG issues. Therefore, you may be more willing to listen. Maybe this is something you can check in the cross-section. And the second thing that comes out of that is that the collaboration matters. These engagements are not always alone. And this is something like when you are now looking at this company as NBIM itself, obviously you find some findings, but well, maybe they can be collaborating or coordinating, or these engagements might be correlated with other institutions. And in a follow-up paper, basically, that's kind of the coordinated engagements. We dig deeper into that. And one other thing that comes to that is that this investors' exposure and holdings in target companies increase success and impact, which is, I think, in line with what you're saying as well. Now, this is where I stand. Therefore, I find it very sensible. Now, there are two other NBIM papers that I thought might be of interest. One is by Briere, Puget, and Ureche. I hope I say the names properly or comes close. They are comparing BlackRock versus Norway. It's almost like bringing these two titans and then let's see how they behave in these shareholder meetings. And what they find is that in general, they tend to oppose the management. This is again a bit like I think in spirit with the entrenchment index. Like I think when you were setting these things up, you were looking at these governance indices where which ones of them are really basically contested. They are kind of also taking this as an example that basically when you're contesting the management, perhaps this shows that you are active. What they find is that NBIM opposes management more often than BlackRock does. And in fact, the way I basically keep this paper in mind is in Turkish, we tend to tell all the letters in a word, but in English and in many other languages, sometimes many of the letters are omitted. I don't understand why and how, but maybe the one way to think about it is it's like you say no way. Basically, you don't say the R. That's kind of how basically the Norwegian fund applies, that they go and vote no in many of the cases. And then they are particularly voting no or opposing the management in environmental and social issues. Basically, the point is you're looking at the governance, but governance might be kind of a part of a much bigger, basically, strategy. In fact, the governance could be just a Trojan horse that came into basically the finance first. And now with that, the soldiers are coming out and then environment and social matters as well. Therefore, you may want to think those as well. And another take on this paper that basically the way these authors are interpreting these two basically companies, BlackRock versus Norwegian fund, they see the Norwegian fund kind of doing a delegated philanthropy on behalf of its citizens. Maybe this is kind of speaking to what you're saying, oh, these are some companies we like or we don't like. That's maybe kind of reflecting the nation's principles or views. Whereas the BlackRock is more like a universal ownership. When we define this active ownership, it's obviously, that's something we may want to keep in mind as well. Now, a second paper that I want to draw attention is just, again, very coincidentally, this is our PhD student, Vaska Atadarkua. She's also looking at NBIM, but interestingly, she's exactly looking at the dual problem that these authors are looking at. Authors are basically looking at what happens to the companies that is in the portfolio of the NBIM. She is looking at what happens to the companies that are excluded. And she finds that basically there's a negative impact. Basically, once Norwegians exclude you, or excommunicate you perhaps, then you are basically, you're experiencing a negative return. And also some other ethically sensitive investors are divesting. This is also coming back to my earlier point that this could be more like a collaborated or correlated kind of approach. Maybe the effects you're finding could partially be driven by Norway, but it could be, in fact, a bigger coalition's effect. Okay, now my comments on the analysis. The first thing is, in the paper, many of the results are coming right after 2012. This is an illustration of the graph. Basically, there is no difference if you look at the confidence intervals between before basically 2012. And then after 2012, suddenly the governance index or scores of the companies that are in the portfolio are higher. If you also look at the regression analysis, there is no stars before 2012, and then after 2012, there are 3 stars. That's very clear. It seems that something happened in 2012. But the one concern is that, well, this announcement, which authors are saying unexpected, happened in November 2012. And as I understand, these things are collected by the end of the year. Then it has to basically happen within a month that all these governance changes are happening. And that's something we were also talking over the break. Maybe one thing could be that easy things could be done quickly. And maybe it takes to handle the bigger ones later on, but this is something to check, I think. The other issue is that it seems that most of the action happened also between 2011 and 12. You see there's this big jump here. You also see that over and over again in the paper when you look at the tables. Well, in 2011, what you are observing is that there's an unusual number of exits. Normally a company exits, I don't know how much, 60, 70 firms. But in that year, there was 228 exits. And perhaps this might be driving some of the results in the sense that if they really kicked out the bad guys before they kind of announced this note, this might be basically driving some of the results. Of course, this is a little bit of worrisome because then it's difficult to argue that this note was totally unexpected or it could have been already somewhat cooking up, and some people might either have known about that or anticipated about that because clearly exited companies are experiencing some negative effect. Okay, this is the comment number 1. The number 2 is the econ index scores. The paper goes through, I think, a good discussion about the MBIM investment, but the econ scores are just taken as they are. And as we know, these ESG scores are notoriously, even if they have really good intentions, they are notoriously problematic for various reasons. And I think it would be helpful if the authors could discuss a bit more and do much more analysis just to convince that the results are not driven by something related to these scores. Just to illustrate, I got it from this. Econ is basically under the Thomson Reuters, and I got their 2019 report that kind of tells you basically the evolution of this score, where in 2011, which I already highlighted that something fishy, something interesting was going on, they included, for instance, Russell 1000 companies or MSCI emerging markets. Like once you include these companies into the score, inevitably it may change the nature of the score. And also it may change, even if the control companies the treated companies are not affected, maybe the control companies might be affected. I'm not saying this is like a smoking gun, but something that you may want to, I think, do some extra analysis on that. At the moment, the authors are only using, as I mentioned over here, the management scores of econ, which is a part of their governance, basically, product, but they have also apparently access, I guess, to shareholders and CSR scores, plus environmental and social scores. Maybe checking those scores might be helpful as well. Now, the last point on the analysis is the MBIM's investment strategy. This is, again, the formula that was also shared by Vicente that shows how MBIM invests. But then remember, look, they have a formula, but then they also have some sort of a flexibility in changing things. Number 1, when I just go to their website, they say the benchmark is set by the Ministry of Finance on the basis of indices from FTSE Group and Bloomberg Barclays indices. Now, this was FTSE Global. I'm not sure how much role Bloomberg Barclays indices plays here. Maybe this is something recent in 2019, but I would like to know exactly that this is not driven by some other indices that they are benchmarking themselves. Another issue is that their equity allocation is changing over years. In fact, my colleagues in Cambridge, Elroy Dimson and David Chambers, they are in touch with MBIM. In fact, Elroy, I think, was the academic director of their, I think, ESG council or so. The point is basically when I discussed with them, they were mentioning that over time the equity allocation of the MBM increased. And this is basically something to keep in mind that some of these basically changes might be driven by just a change in the rules of these equity allocation. And finally, they say that if the equity allocation in the actual benchmark index moves significantly higher or lower than the strategic allocation, there are rules on rebalancing of equity allocation in the actual benchmark index. Well, is rebalancing itself will inevitably create a mean reversion. And again, this is something that I think the authors perhaps should shed some light on. Now, the suggestions, I think what I would like to know is which components out of these 34 governance scores do improve, right? That's, I think, that would be nice to know. What do they improve? What do firms improve? The second thing is, for some, maybe you wanted to just stick to the governance scores, but I think I would inevitably be interested in what is the value, performance, risk, and ownership implications of all these things. In the end, do they create value? Do they evaporate some value? Do they decrease risk? Does the ownership of these companies by socially conscious investors increase after the MBIM's announcement? Another point I want to make is that, in fact, there could be, different ways of doing things. In Turkish, we say every man has his own way of eating yogurt. Basically, it's a very simple process, but you will do it in a very different way. Whereas in Norwegian, maybe since it's linked to the government, maybe you may kind of take it might be much easier to engage with the firms directly. Whereas in the US, maybe these big three, they may be refraining to do that themselves, but then they can get a proxy advisor to do it on behalf of them. They can just whisper them or tell them what are the good governance practices, and then these ISS or other glass levies might set these rules that might kind of basically achieve the similar results, which I think there's some literature on that might be relevant to what you're discussing here. The final thing is, this is just a note, maybe it's just an exposition thing, but when you get these delta GTs, the way it is defined is this T plus 1 minus T, whereas I was expecting T minus T minus 1, but maybe I am getting confused. Is there some sort of a forward-looking? I checked the regressions, many of them are not, but in 1 or 2 regressions, I felt maybe there could be a bit of a forward-looking, but this is something to check quickly. I think that concludes my discussion. Am I on time? Yeah. Okay, thanks very much for your attention.
For the thorough discussion, let me comment on some of the things. Many of the things I think are very relevant. Whether the effect happens in 2012 or slightly before, we do believe that some of the effect is happening gradually before November 2012. Otherwise, it doesn't make a lot of sense, this very sharp reaction. The question is whether it happens, and I think we have some evidence that it happens before. The question is if it happens way too early. If it starts happening in 2011, well, maybe we need to sanitize, say 2012, and it's fine. I mean, it's something we've tried, and we could just eliminate a year from the sample. But that's definitely something, identifying the exact moment or the rough moment where this change in stance happened, it's very important. ICON, yes, I think we wanted to tie our hands with using some off-the-shelf index, but it is very limited in some ways. Not so much in our case, because remember that either we're using a snapshot of the index, so composition is not an issue, or we're using a full panel of firms for the second part, where again, composition is not an issue. But definitely we could use our own index or try to look into the different provisions, especially also regarding your last comment, maybe, what is really changing? Are these the provisions that are less costly, maybe less important, or is this really meaningful improvements in governance? This is something that we would definitely like to know. Value is a big, it was a small comment, but it's a big question, right? There are a lot of things we cannot say. There's a few things we can say. Things we cannot say, the overall effect on value is difficult. We don't have a clear date to do an event study. An event study with 2 years will not be very, very meaningful, so that's basically out of the question. We cannot use this as an IV for governance affects value because it's too broad. I mean, the reduced form of that regression would be whether the firms inside MBIM perform better or worse before and after, but many things are changing. So that we cannot do either. But one thing we can do is to try to get a sense of the trade-off that MBIM faces when picking better governance firms. And that we are working on it. Basically, the alphas of the firms that enter and exit MBIM before and after the announcement. And it's provisional, and you know, I don't want to oversell it yet, but there may be a sense of a slight trade-off there. You know, if you want to really stick to your good governance principles, you may need to make concessions in terms of dropping some firms that you may like, but they're very poorly governed, and vice versa. But take it with 2 pinches of salt, because you know I didn't even put it in the slides because we don't have final results there. One final thing, entry. So this is a period of expansion of the fund, and one thing I didn't show, but that is in the last part of the paper. At some point, it does seem that it gets challenging to pick good governed firms from the pool of firms outside MBIM. So the new entrants do have worse the fresh entrants. But mechanically have worse governance than the old ones because they come from a broader pool, right? But that's not an effect. You know, when you do it in a full panel in a way, you know, the governance improves, but when you do it in an expanding kind of way, the governance of the new entrants can be worse. But many thanks, very thorough, and you did a better job. I mean, it was challenging to put it all in 20 minutes. You put it all in one slide. I thought that was great.
Okay.
Question.
So now we have like 15 minutes for Q&A.
Yes.
So one thing is, I mean, like when they changed their investment strategy, they must have been forward-looking in terms of thinking, you know, where is governance for this firm is going, right? So the static feature of, you know, the governance right now is this. We don't like it. Let's shed this firm. It could be that the governance was improving, and so we're going to keep this firm because. So the decision should be made based on the expectation of governance, not on the, you know, status quo of governance.
Yes, I mean, it's related also to Augustin's point. I think we take a snapshot just before the announcement as, you know, these are kind of randomly allocated firms, and then we see, not randomly, but basically exogenous to the announcement, and basically we move forward. I think we do also the exercise, or we should do, and we should present it, of taking earlier snapshots, because it's very correlated. I mean, you know, the holdings are very correlated. So we could just go to 2010 or 2009, because it's true that from an optimal strategy of the fund, if you know you're going to announce it, you should rebalance first and then announce. Yes, but then, you know, you can go back 2 years and, you know, or you can, you know, that you can solve that question by taking earlier snapshots and see, you know, especially depending on how early you knew about these changing preferences. But I agree, you know, that's, and there's a rebalancing just around the node, so we should take care of that.
Maybe I should comment, and thank you. It's a very interesting paper, and of course, being head of corporate governance for NBIM, it's very nice to see that the research says that our work has some effect, and that's what we want. And just to say, I mean, this paper in a way is exactly how we want to work, because being an owner in more than 9,000 companies, we want to work on sort of broad basis, principle basis, state our preferences on governance, on the ESG issues in general, and publish that to the whole market, and hope that the companies we have invested in take account of that, which it seems that they do, and that again is basis for our engagement. So that's great if that works. A few sort of maybe surprising findings for me. Again, you know, we tend to think about the ownership work we do as long-term, taking time. We think about an issue, then we publish something, then maybe changes will happen. So I'm also surprised about this big upturn 2011, 2012. And I guess the discussion probably put it better than me, but it'd be interesting to see, you know, what are the, you know, what's the changes in our investment universe? What other reasons can there be? And this is before my time, but I do think, for instance, we started these risk-based divestments in 2011. And that may have been also based on other consideration than governance, ENS, but could also then take out quite a few companies with the ENS issues. I think we started the coal and palm oil divestments around that time. But anyway, we do publish that. So we don't name the companies we divest from there, but we name sort of the reasons behind it, and we mention the numbers. The other thing is that the smaller firms did better than larger ones. Maybe it's easy for them to change, but the way we work is we try to sort of concentrate at least the dialogue with bigger firms. So we would have thought in a way that they would have changed more because there is sort of would have followed up more with dialogue. Then finally, but that was more to the discussion paper, this delegated philanthropy term, we're not too keen on that, just have said that. Maybe I said we invest more in companies we like and don't like, but what I should have said is we invest more, we can overweight, underweight, but it's not based on likes and dislikes, it's based on good ESG disclosure, analysis, and assessment. So just to have put that down. But thank you very much. Very interesting, and I'll read it with interest. And happy to engage more if you want. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, just one comment. I think in the heterogeneous effects, of course, at some point becomes challenging. For example, smaller firms are also firms in which the fund tends to have higher proportion of the firm very often, and that's one of the effects we find very, very strongly. So sometimes, there's more than one. Also, the pre-existing governance of smaller firms may be worse, so they may have more margin. So I think, there's more than one margin in which, this engagement can operate. With respect to potential earlier effects, definitely, I mean, we can show some robustness, some evidence that, it goes beyond that. I think, I think we want. Ideally, as a researcher, we want something really sharp at an annual level. But of course, this is a process, I understand, and we should, we should look into that. Maybe you could give us more information at some point about, how this evolved. Questions?
Yes, I've never worked with the index that you're using, but I have a couple of papers, federalized consulate papers, where we use the ISS index that had more than 40 attributes of governance. We showed that value was increasing in the index kind of across the world, which would be not kind of good for the open part in the sense that there's no reason for that to apply either. But one benefit of those indices, which I assume exists for you as well, is that you can distinguish between provisions that can be implemented very quickly, when you kind of pull a switch and it's done, versus those that are much more consequential. So you'll be able to, the changes happen quickly because of those provisions, then that would be quite instructive. But would also raise questions as to kind of the validation of the changes, things that changes that can be implemented by putting a switch away may not have the same value.
Yeah, I thought.
One thing that eventually was developing with ISS is that they started going around and offering consulting services about how to increase your governance score. And you can see that this might not happen here as well, because there's value to having innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. So we try not to attach a strong flavor of this is a genuine improvement in sound improvement in the underlying governance, because we haven't yet, and we're working on it, try to look into the different elements or different components of it. Because I agree, some of the speed of some of the adjustments suggests that some of the less costly improvements were the ones who reacted first, and maybe those are meaningful, but maybe those are not the most meaningful for the very nature of they are less costly and they are not, they are easier to implement. There is some momentum though, but it's much more modest, right? So this, you go from 0 to 3 and then from 3 to 5 over 3 years. So that momentum maybe is more meaningful than this initial jump, but it's ongoing. I think we're working on the decomposition of what's really going on. For now, we just wanted to take something that was kind of. We wanted to tie our hands as much as possible in not choosing what's in there or not, but I think this is a first pass. I agree.
Ask a question directly to the so you mentioned, Corinne, that you used to call it the oil fund, right? So there's a liability you're causing greenhouse by extracting the oil, and then you're going in the financial markets with ESG principles investing. Have you ever computed how much offsetting you are doing? Or has this ever been considered? I think it's being controversial on purpose, but you have extracted, right? That is the source of the revenue that you are then investing in the market.
Yes, I mean, we don't hide where the money has come from, of course. I mean, the fund is a result of taking natural resources that's found in the, sort of this generation and transforming it to financial assets, and we say for future generations. That's really what we're doing. So we open about where it comes from, and that's why Norway is also called the oil fund. It's not a fund about offsetting. It's about a fund about transferring wealth, really, from, as I said, natural resources to financial assets, and not using it all at once, but investing and just doing, taking out small parts of it. It's really the point is then to contribute to the welfare state. So we don't see it as offsetting. And again, the mission of the fund is to have the highest possible return with moderate risk. But what we do see is, we see there is a link between, or we believe there is a link between sustainable business practices in the long term and the long-term value of the fund. And that's why we engage. So it's not from an offsetting perspective or other reasons. It's sort of what we see as protecting the long-term value of the fund. We do publish our carbon footprint every year, but as I said, the engagement, the ESG engagement, is based upon the belief that it will reduce risk and result in long-term value creation.
Yes.
I found this quite fascinating because it took me back a couple of decades to when the California Pension Fund was first doing its naming and shaming, so a much more direct way of highlighting companies that it felt had inadequate governance practices. And so I just thought it was really very interesting to see, people used to debate the CalPERS effect, whether it did kickstart long-term changes in governance or whether it was just while they were in the focus of naming and shaming, companies would put window dressing and then their governance practices would go down again. And I thought it was just interesting the different way in which NBIM engages with companies compared to that much more blunt instrument of naming and shaming. Because, the Americans will know, I don't think CalPERS still does that, do they? The naming and shaming, or do they still do it?
They don't. They stopped this.
Sorry, they still
stopped
do.
This particular
Yeah, that's what I thought. And they stopped it, 8 years ago or 10 years ago, something like that. And so it's quite interesting, this more subtle way of, not investing or... Anyway, I just thought they were interesting parallels there.
I agree there are parallelisms with the CalPERS example, which is in a way halfway between what Augustin kind of works is like singling out a specific firm where we want to enact change. This is more of a systemic, we want to change everything. This is more of a focus group within the portfolio, but it does have some similitudes. And the work with CalPERS is particularly good at value effects because these were kind of announced and there's a lot of variation. Not so good with the change that actually happened inside the firm, the academic work concentrating on that. I think we can focus more on what happened with the firms rather than value. But I agree, there's a lot of parallels with those changes and even with academic work that concentrated on those changes. I agree.
So if not, can I abuse my right as a chair and ask you a question to Karin? That so our discussion raised the issue that whether really this note was unexpected. So I was just wondering, how long have you been considering internally to release this document in 2012? And you, as our discussion showed, you divested from many companies in 2011. So when did you really start this idea of like these governance changes and other things?
Yeah, this, as I said, when this paper came out in 2012, I didn't work in the fund, so just said that. But I know it was a result of long discussions with thinking about what's important governance issues for us. What do we care about? And a principle for the fund is to be transparent and publishing, our beliefs. But I think this was a culmination of work that had sort of been going on for a long time. But we continue doing that work. So corporate governance is a focus area, as you say. So we keep on issuing positions within corporate governance. So it's still very much in the forefront of what we do and how we engage with the companies. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but it's very much a focus area for us. And many of the issues that we raised in that paper, we continue to work on these days. Yep.
Okay. No one else? Okay, so thank you so much for a wonderful presentation.